Have you ever imagined discovering, after decades of marriage, that the man you trusted most wasn't who he seemed? How do you react when your husband, your prayer partner, your role model within the church turns out to be a silent betrayer? Perhaps you know someone who has been through this, or perhaps you yourself are facing this pain right now. What I'm going to share here isn't just a common story of infidelity, but a profound, emotional account marked by betrayal, abandonment, judgment, and silencing, all within the context of faith. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you. My name is Linda Marie Walker. I'm 65 years old, and today I decided to open my heart. For a long time, I kept my voice quiet. I was afraid of what people would think, afraid of being singled out, afraid of not being understood. The pain of betrayal isn't just between two people. It wounds the soul, shakes trust, and is often intensified by the weight of judgment from those who should offer support. Have you ever experienced this? That feeling of needing to be strong, but inside everything is falling apart? I lived a marriage that seemed perfect to everyone. Inside the church, we were seen as a model couple, a beacon of faith and commitment. But behind closed doors, signs began to appear. Subtle changes in behavior, poorly explained apologies, silences that spoke louder than words, and my heart began to feel what I didn't want to believe, the shadow of infidelity. From that moment on, my faith was tested like never before. I wondered, how could a man who speaks in the name of God betray me so cruelly? Where was the Lord in the midst of this pain? There were nights of prayer, days of silence, and a crushing loneliness. Because even within the Christian community, I heard, "Pray more, hold on, don't expose your husband." But I couldn't bear to be silent any longer. And it was at this point in my life that something unexpected happened. For years, I carried this story in silence. Not because I lacked words, but because my fear was greater. The fear of judgment, the fear of dirty looks, the fear of being seen not as a victim, but as guilty. Within the community where I sought refuge, I encountered invisible walls that forced me into silence. They told me I should pray more, be patient, endure as a test of faith. And with each sentence, my voice faded a little further. It was as if there were a hidden truth no one dared touch. The pain of women who suffer within their own faith. This silence, however, had a devastating impact. On the outside, I smiled, kept up appearances, and attended services, but inside, my soul screamed. There was a chasm between the image people saw and the reality I lived behind the scenes in my home. Trust was gone, and the feeling of abandonment was suffocating. The man who promised to be my partner until the end, the same man who opened the Bible to counsel others, was also the one who secretly tore at my heart. For years, I tried to reconcile what I believed with what I was experiencing. The faith that once sustained me seemed fragile in the face of betrayal, and I wondered if I had done something wrong. Were my prayers not enough? Was I not good enough as a wife? This guilt-ridden mentality felt like a prison, and the cruelest part is that many women go through this and believe they need to remain silent because they were taught to endure. But enduring is not the same as living. I decided to break free. I decided my story wouldn't be buried under shame. That wasn't mine. That was the moment of transformation, when I realized that if I didn't speak out, the lies would continue to reign. The decision to speak out, to tell what was really happening, was a turning point in my journey. And don't think it was easy. Every word I said felt like it carried an immense weight. But at the same time, it brought liberation. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because there is a revelation that completely changed the way I saw my life, my marriage, and even my faith. I had been married for over 30 years, and everyone around me saw us as an exemplary couple. The image we projected was one of harmony, companionship, and unwavering faith. At church gatherings, we were always invited to testify to our unity. At family gatherings, we were a beacon of stability. To many, I was living a Christian fairy tale, but the hidden truth lay behind the scenes, away from prying eyes. Behind the perfect facade lay secrets that eroded my peace and undermined the trust I had always cultivated. This duality between appearance and reality was one of the greatest emotional impacts I faced. When you live sustaining an image that doesn't match what's happening inside your home, wear and tear is inevitable. Your heart begins to carry an invisible weight, and your mind is torn between the need to keep up appearances and the desperate desire to cry for help. It's a silent journey where every public gesture contrasts with the private emptiness. I knew something was wrong, but I preferred to believe it was all just a figment of my imagination, because accepting the possibility of betrayal was unbearable. Deep down, the mindset of those trapped in a seemingly perfect life is one of denial. It was easier to tell myself that everything was fine, that my husband was just tired, that the changes in his behavior were temporary. I clung to any explanation that would keep the image of an ideal family intact. After all, who would want to admit that their own life didn't live up to everyone's expectations? It was an unconscious decision, choosing illusion over pain. But the longer the illusion is nurtured, the greater the impact when reality finally sets in. I remember watching him during services, preaching about fidelity, love, and commitment, and wondering if those words still held any real meaning for him. The contrast between what he said publicly and what I felt inside was suffocating. Each time he spoke about integrity, a cruel doubt grew within me. Was I married to a character? What if it was all just a well-staged performance? These inner revelations left me even more fragile because they made me realize that the life I presented to the world might never have truly been mine. This dilemma between the projected image and the hidden truth led me to reflect deeply on choices and consequences. Transformation begins precisely at this point, when we understand that living by appearances may deceive others, but it destroys those who carry the secret. The perfection everyone admired was a sandcastle, and each wave of distrust threatened to topple it. Until one day, the signs became so clear there was no denying them. It was at that moment that I realized my life was about to change forever, and that I would have to face a revelation that would transform not only my marriage, but the way I saw everything around me. To this day, I remember the feeling of living in two worlds, the one everyone admired and the one only I knew. The discrepancy between these two universes consumed me, because every compliment to the perfect couple was like a blade cutting through my skin. And what hurt most was knowing I couldn't shout this truth, couldn't reveal to anyone the weight I carried. Then, when I finally began to put into words everything I'd experienced, I discovered there's a special power in sharing. Speaking is liberating, but hearing other voices echoing the same pain also brings healing. That's why I want to open this space for you. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what's touched you most so far. Maybe you've experienced something similar, know someone who's gone through a similar journey, or are even silently facing the same struggles. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this kind of content. When you comment, you not only strengthen this community, but also give courage to other women who feel alone. Sometimes, a single sentence from you can be the push someone needs to break the silence. I truly believe that every story has an impact. Every voice that joins this conversation breaks down the wall of fear a little further. So, if something within you has been awakened, don't keep it to yourself. Write, share your feelings, your opinions, or even your doubts. This helps show that no one is isolated in this pain, and that together we can transform experiences of suffering into paths of transformation. As I opened my heart and realized I wasn't alone in experiencing this contradiction between the perfect image and the painful reality, I began to understand that this contrast hid much more than it seemed. And it was precisely at this point that a specific detail changed my entire perception and opened an unexpected door in my journey. I've always been dedicated to my faith, my family, and the church, believing that everything rests on trust. From a young age, my identity was deeply tied to these pillars. I was the woman everyone saw as an example of devotion, always ready to help, to listen, to lend a helping hand. Faith was my armor, family my refuge, and the church the place where I believed I'd find answers to all my pain. I felt genuine pride in fulfilling this role, because in my heart, I believed I was living the way God intended. For many years, this mindset brought me strength and direction. I was convinced that the values that guided my life were unshakable. I believed that if I remained faithful, everything around me would remain steadfast as well. This was the logic I carried within me. Obedience and dedication were seeds that would bear fruits of love and respect. But real life, behind the scenes, began to show that the equation wasn't so simple. Behind the facade of stability, the cracks were deepening, and I could no longer ignore them. The cruelest thing was feeling that the more I tried to uphold the image of a perfect family, the further I became from the hidden truth growing before my eyes. The trust that should have been the foundation turned into doubt. I felt like someone holding a cracked crystal glass. Any false move could shatter it forever. My faith remained my safe haven, but even that began to be shaken by the weight of the betrayal I already sensed, even without concrete proof. It was a confusing journey, because while I prided myself on my dedication and commitment, there was a silent impact taking place within me. I felt trapped between two worlds. On one side, the desire to preserve appearances, to be seen as the ideal wife. On the other, the internal cry for freedom, for answers, for courage. This contradiction was one of the most difficult moments of my life, because it forced me to make invisible decisions every day. Should I continue pretending everything was in order? Or should I start facing the revelations that were already knocking at my door? The transformation didn't begin with a single major event, but with small, accumulated insights. A phrase spoken out of context, a distant look, an absence that seemed longer than usual. These signs pushed me toward the inevitable conclusion that something was wrong. And the more I tried to compensate with prayers, acts of kindness, and patience, the more I felt like I was fighting alone against a storm that had already gathered. Being a woman of faith, at that moment, also meant facing the shadow of doubt. I wondered if believing too much had blinded me to reality. Had my unshakable confidence turned into naivete? This reflection was painful, but also necessary, because it showed me that even faith needs to be accompanied by discernment. Loving, trusting, and dedication cannot be excuses for accepting lies or covering up infidelity. As I struggled to keep up appearances, I realized that the truth always finds a way to reveal itself, and it was precisely at this point in my journey that a seemingly small detail became the trigger for a change I never imagined I would experience. Small actions began to bother me, and that's when my intuition awakened to something I hadn't wanted to see. He no longer looked me in the eye with the same firmness as before. Conversations became quicker, as if time with him were always on a timer. The excuses became more and more frequent. Unexpected meetings, work commitments that came out of nowhere, delays that didn't suit the punctual man I'd known. At first, I tried to justify everything in my own head, because believing there was a hidden truth behind it was too painful. But the impact of these small changes began to accumulate, and each detail was like a shadow growing silently between us. There were also secrets disguised as distractions. He would subtly hide his phone, even taking it to the bathroom, and when he received messages at night, he would turn away so I wouldn't see the screen. These silent revelations, these hidden signs hidden behind the scenes of everyday life, made me uneasy. I wondered, is this really true? Or is it just my mind playing tricks on me? Doubt is cruel because it slowly erodes trust. It's not like a sudden fall, but like a seepage that gradually weakens the structure until everything collapses. My mindset back then was still that of a wife who believes she can fix anything with patience and love. I believed that if I showed even more affection, if I made even more of an effort, maybe he would return to the man I knew. But the truth is, nothing I did changed the invisible distances growing between us. On the contrary, it seemed the more I tried to get closer, the more he retreated into his own world. It's amazing how, on the journey of someone who experiences the pain of betrayal, perception sharpens. I began to notice changes in his tone of voice, the way he dressed when he went out, even the scent of his perfume, which seemed different. Small things, which for many might go unnoticed, for me were signs of an approaching revelation. And even though I tried to deny it, the certainty grew within me that a decision was being made, not for me, but for him. These subtle transformations had a profound impact on how I viewed my marriage. I could no longer pray with the same calmness, because the questions haunted me. Was I living a lie? To what extent was the trust we'd built real, and to what extent was it all just an act? This doubt began to consume me, and the more I tried to remain calm, the faster my heart raced as the evidence emerged. Deep down, I knew that time would bring answers, because truth has a way of revealing itself. What I didn't imagine was how much these small changes would be just the beginning of a painful journey, full of discoveries that would shake not only my marriage, but also my understanding of life, faith, and the choices I would have to make from then on. My heart screamed that something was wrong, but my mind insisted on convincing me otherwise. No, he's a man of faith. He wouldn't do that. This internal battle was one of the most difficult I've ever faced. It was as if there were two versions of the same woman inside me, one who saw the signs clearly, who noticed the details and knew nothing was by chance, and another who clung desperately to the hope that it was all just an illusion created by my insecurity. The pain of distrust is treacherous because it doesn't just bring suffering, it slowly erodes confidence, self-esteem, and even the way we see ourselves. His every gesture seemed to carry a different weight. When he came home and avoided eye contact, my heart raced. When he said he was too busy to talk, I felt invisible. But the most distressing thing was when he showed affection in a calculated way, as if trying to balance a scale that had already tipped. I sensed there was a hidden truth to the relationship, a hidden truth he didn't want me to discover, and this kept me on constant alert. It was like living in a minefield, where every step could reveal something I didn't want to face. There were nights when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't fit. I wondered if I was exaggerating, if my mind wasn't creating baseless stories. But deep down, feminine intuition has an inexplicable, almost spiritual power. There's a sensitivity that goes beyond logic, alerting us when the truth is trying to emerge. I knew this, but the mindset I'd carried for so many years, that a man of faith would never make such a mistake, paralyzed me. This internal conflict had a huge impact on my journey. I prayed for clarity, asking God to show me what was real and what was the fruit of my fear. At the same time, I felt guilty for doubting, as if distrusting him were also a way of betraying the faith I professed. It was a web of feelings that suffocated me: love, fear, insecurity, distrust, and even shame. Shame at thinking that perhaps I had been deceived for so long. Shame at imagining what people would say if they found out. Shame at admitting that my life wasn't the perfect portrait everyone believed. Gradually, I realized that this pain stemmed not only from the possibility of betrayal, but from the clash of mindsets. I had learned to trust blindly, believing that devotion to faith was a shield against human weaknesses. But real life doesn't follow idealized scripts. The truth is that any relationship is made of choices, and every decision made in secret has the power to completely transform a family's destiny. This revelation was harsh, but necessary. Faith doesn't prevent anyone from making mistakes, and trust can't be so blind that it erases obvious signs. This mix of feelings transformed me into silence, because while I tried to maintain my balance on the outside, on the inside, I was no longer the same. And it was in this fragile state that a specific situation occurred, something small at first glance, but which would become the trigger for a series of discoveries that would change everything I believed about my marriage. I asked myself, how could a man who preaches the love of Christ betray me like this? This question echoed within me like an open wound, unanswered. It was as if my entire spiritual universe had been shaken at once. I felt deceived not only by him, but in a way by God as well. After all, I had dedicated my entire life to living within the principles of faith, believing that obedience would bring protection, that devotion would be enough to shield my marriage from any threat. And suddenly, what I feared most was before me, tearing apart every certainty I held. The spiritual conflict that took hold of my heart was brutal. Part of me wanted to cling even tighter to my faith, asking for strength, asking for clarity, begging for an explanation that would justify so much suffering. But another part rebelled, questioning whether it was all just a show, whether I hadn't lived for decades believing in promises that held no value. This contradiction gnawed at me because I didn't want to give up on God, but I felt he had abandoned me at that moment when I needed him most. Behind the scenes of my prayer life, the silence felt deafening. I knelt, cried out, wept, but many days it felt like my words were hitting the ceiling and coming back to me. It was a spiritual emptiness that mixed with the pain of betrayal and made me doubt even my own identity. Who was I? After all, if the foundation on which I had built my life was cracked? I stared at the open Bible and wondered if the promises of care still applied to me or if I had been forgotten. This crisis profoundly affected my mindset. For the first time, I realized that I had practically placed my husband in the place of God. My trust in him was so blind that when he fell, it seemed my entire faith fell with it. This revelation hurt, but it also brought a reality check. Loving God above all else also means not idolizing anyone, not even those who walk beside us. This realization was the beginning of a silent transformation, even though it was initially steeped in pain and confusion. At the same time, there was a latent anger that I didn't know how to deal with. How could a man raise his voice from the pulpit to speak of love, fidelity, and commitment, and then at night surrender to the opposite? It was a duplicity that sickened me, and I didn't know whether to feel more angry at him or at myself for having believed so much. It was a shock that mixed personal and spiritual revelations, because I began to understand that someone's faith can be nothing more than a well-constructed mask. This conflict led to sleepless nights, alternating between desperate prayers and tears of anger. It was a mixture of searching and denial, hope and bitterness. I wanted to believe there was still redemption, but every time I recalled the details of the betrayal, I felt that possibility slipping away. The impact was so great that even my body reacted. Insomnia, loss of appetite, a constant feeling of heaviness on my shoulders. All of this reflected an invisible war raging within me. And it was in this scenario of spiritual and emotional despair that I began to realize how much the silence imposed by the community around me intensified my pain. Because, while I drowned in unanswered questions, the voices from outside only reinforced the idea that I should endure in silence, hiding the truth. That was already impossible to deny. When I tried to share my pain, I heard, "Pray more, hold on tight, don't expose your husband." That silenced me in a way that even betrayal hadn't. It was as if, instead of finding a welcoming space, I'd hit a cold wall of judgment disguised as spiritual counsel. I expected to find open arms, but I found closed doors. I felt like the responsibility for his sin had been placed on my shoulders, as if my job was to endure, keep quiet, and somehow save the reputation of the one who hurt me. This imposed silence was suffocating. It came not only from the words I heard, but from the looks in their eyes that carried hidden messages. It was as if they were saying, "Don't destroy the image of the perfect family. Don't tarnish the testimony of the church." I began to realize that, more than just dealing with the pain of betrayal, I was now facing an entire system dedicated to keeping up appearances. The impact this had on my journey was profound, because it made me question the extent of community loyalty and the extent of truth. Was protecting a man's image more important than protecting a woman's emotional and spiritual health? Behind the scenes, I cried alone, stifling words that needed to be said. I kept questions to myself that never found an answer. The silence they imposed on me wasn't just a lack of voice. It was also a lack of validation, a lack of empathy. I was alive, wounded, bleeding inside, and at the same time, I was treated like a shadow who needed only to remain silent so as not to disturb. This kind of mentality is devastating because it convinces many women that their pain doesn't matter, that what really matters is maintaining a facade. But something inside me wouldn't accept this logic. No matter how much I obeyed on the outside, inside, my soul rebelled. It was as if God whispered to my heart that this hidden truth couldn't remain hidden forever, that my pain had a greater purpose than being stifled by fear of what people would think. This revelation began to change the way I saw everything. I realized that transformation wouldn't come from outside, from the church, the community, or from people. It needed to be born within me, through the courageous decision to no longer allow lies to dictate the rules of my life. Still, it wasn't easy. Each step toward the truth seemed to defy centuries of tradition, unwritten rules, and expectations imposed on us women. I felt my voice was too small in the face of such a vast system. And at the same time, I knew that if I didn't speak out, I would remain trapped in an endless cycle of pain and silence. It was at this crossroads that I began to understand that my fight wasn't just against a man's betrayal, but against an entire structure that normalizes female suffering in the name of appearance. And this understanding was the point where my journey took a new direction, preparing me for decisions that would change everything from then on. I went to church and smiled, but inside I cried. No one knew what I was carrying. Every Sunday, I put on my best clothes, fixed my hair, practiced my smile, and entered that temple as if I were just one of so many women of faith who seemed to have their lives in perfect order. On the outside, I was the same Linda everyone knew, steadfast, dedicated, and involved. But inside, my heart was broken, and every hymn I sang was accompanied by silent tears that no one saw. Loneliness within faith carries a different weight because it combines two pains, the human pain of betrayal and the spiritual pain of feeling invisible before God and fellow believers. I looked at the people around me and wondered how many of them were also hiding scars behind rehearsed smiles. It was like living inside a theater where backstage was filled with painful revelations, but on stage everyone had to appear happy and fulfilled. This contrast consumed me because I felt like my life was a lie repeated week after week. I didn't have the courage to share my burden because I already knew what the answer would be, that I should be more patient, stronger, that God was testing me. This mindset, which should have brought comfort, only increased the weight I carried. It was as if my pain was always invalidated, always relegated to the background of the need to save face. The impact of this was devastating. I was not only alone within my marriage, but now I was also alone within my faith. There were times when I thought about abandoning everything, stopping going to church, walking away completely, but something inside me wouldn't allow it. It was as if a voice insisted that even amidst the loneliness, there was a hidden purpose to my journey. I needed to find that purpose. I needed to believe that my suffering wasn't in vain. This revelation began to give me the strength to carry on, even if I staggered. I understood that, even when everyone's eyes seemed indifferent, there was a God who saw my tears. Behind the scenes, when no one else could. This experience shaped a new mindset in me. I began to realize that true faith isn't measured by the number of smiles we display in front of others, but by the ability to remain standing even when everything inside is crumbling. The loneliness I experienced gradually transformed into a calling to something greater, even though at that time I couldn't fully understand what it was. I only knew that something was about to happen, something that would change the course of my story and force me to face head-on the truth I'd been trying so hard to hide. It was then that I decided, if he thought he could fool me, I would let him fall into his own trap. That loneliness that haunted me, that silence that suffocated me, began to transform into fuel for something greater. I no longer wanted to simply endure, no longer content to live behind the scenes of a story that wasn't true. It was time to make decisions that would end the illusion, and, at the same time, open space for a new phase of my journey. The pain pushed me forward, but it was courage that kept me firm when I decided to act. At first, it seemed impossible to even consider confronting him. My mindset was still steeped in fear and doubt. Did I have the right to reveal the truth? Would I be able to face the consequences? But the more I reflected, the clearer it became that allowing the lie to continue would be a form of self-betrayal. I had already been betrayed by him, and I couldn't accept being betrayed by my own omission. This revelation gave me strength I didn't even know I had. I began to observe every detail carefully, as if I were piecing together an invisible puzzle. The excuses, the odd hours, the rehearsed gestures, everything began to fit into a scenario I'd already sensed, but which needed to become concrete. It was almost as if I'd stepped out of the role of silent victim and into the role of someone seeking clarity. This inner transformation was powerful because it showed me that, even amidst the chaos, there was still a force within me capable of guiding my own choices. I knew the impact of this decision would be enormous. Confronting it meant risking losing everything I had built over decades, but it also meant reclaiming something I no longer had: my truth. It was a fine line between fear and liberation, and I chose to cross it. Because deep down, I realized that the greatest prison wasn't the marriage itself, but the silence that kept me trapped. This new mindset helped me see the situation differently. It wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about dignity. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about me. The decision to act was a turning point, a moment when I understood that my life didn't need to be determined by someone else's bad choices. And it was at that point that I began laying the groundwork for something that would completely change the dynamics of our relationship, something he never imagined he would face. I began to observe every movement, every detail, and waited for the right moment. There was no rush, because I knew that rushing could lead me to rash decisions. And at that point in the journey, I needed clarity. The pain of betrayal still throbbed within me, but now it was transformed into strategy. Every distant look, every half-hearted apology, every prolonged absence left traces, and I learned to follow these traces silently, like someone sewing an invisible fabric, stitch by stitch, until the truth revealed itself completely. It was a period of transformation, because for the first time, I wasn't just reacting to what was happening, but taking control of my own path. My victim mentality was giving way to a posture of seeing behind the scenes and deciding to act decisively. I knew that this man trusted my passivity too much, believing that the weight of faith and tradition would keep me silent forever. But without realizing it, he was teaching me with each slip-up how to build my own way out. The days were filled with tension. On the outside, I maintained the same demeanor, participated in activities, fulfilled my responsibilities, but on the inside, each revelation I gathered strengthened me. I didn't want to just accuse. I wanted to hold in my hands what no one could deny. This was the impact of living a double life. On one side, the familiar routine. On the other, a silent investigation, conducted with patience and determination. There were times when I wondered if it wouldn't be better to just explode and let it all out. But something inside me told me that patience was essential. The right moment would come, and when it did, there would be no escaping the truth. This decision brought me a strange sense of power. After so long feeling powerless, it was as if I had reclaimed a part of myself that had been dormant, the courage to face it, to act, to no longer accept lies as part of life. This silent plan required emotional control, and I often cried in secret, asking God if I was doing the right thing. But deep down, I knew the revelation was already happening, little by little, and that soon everything would come to light. I just needed to be prepared for the impact it would have, not only on my marriage, but also on how everyone around us would view the story. And it was in this state of watchful waiting that the decisive moment began to unfold before me, paving the way for something that would completely change the course of that relationship. One night, I confronted him with evidence he couldn't deny. The moment I'd waited so long for arrived like a storm, and I knew there was no turning back. I had in my hands details, messages, traces that spoke louder than any justification. It wasn't just intuition or suspicion, it was the stark truth before us both. And when I laid it all out on the table, I saw the fear in his eyes, a fear that wasn't of losing me, but of seeing the impeccable image he maintained for the world crumble. His reaction was a mixture of shock and despair. For a few seconds, he tried to compose himself, rehearsing phrases that might have diffused the situation, but it was useless. I knew him too well to believe improvised excuses. There was a clear revelation there. He wasn't prepared to deal with the consequences of his own decisions. Behind the scenes of that scene, I realized that my calm demeanor disarmed him more than any shout. He expected an outburst of rage, but found firmness. And that firmness was more powerful than 1,000 accusations. The impact of this confrontation was immediate. He had no way to deny it. There was no escape. I could see in his eyes the awareness that the castle of lies was crumbling. With each sentence I uttered, it was as if I were removing another stone from the wall he had built over time. And, curiously, I felt no pleasure in this silent victory. What I felt was a mixture of pain and relief. Pain at confirming what I had so feared, and relief at finally facing the truth. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The woman who had been silent for years gave way to someone who chose to speak out. It was like walking through a door and never looking back. The transformation was happening in real time, and even through the tears, I knew I was beginning a new journey. It wasn't just about exposing the infidelity. It was about reclaiming my own identity, reclaiming my dignity, and reclaiming the right to choose my own path. He tried to appeal to faith, saying that God could restore all things, but those words rang hollow given the contrast between words and practice. It was too late for clichés. The truth could no longer be hidden. And in the silence that followed, I realized the mask had fallen forever. It was that night that I understood that I could never again be the same woman I'd been, because the revelation of the lie had opened my eyes to a reality I could no longer ignore. And from that moment on, what unfolded was not just the end of a marriage, but the beginning of a transformation that was just beginning. The man admired by all had his mask ripped off, not before the church, but before the truth. It was a moment that seemed suspended in time, as if the world around us had stopped so that only the two of us were there, face to face, with nothing left to hide. For years, he had built an impeccable image, cultivated with beautiful words, rehearsed gestures, and speeches about fidelity and devotion. To the community, he was an example of character, a devoted husband, a spiritual leader. But before me, there was no pulpit, no audience, no stage. All that remained was the rawness of someone who had finally been unmasked behind the scenes of his own life. The impact of this revelation fell not only on him, but on me as well, because, in a way, I too had lived within that illusion, sustaining a narrative that now proved fragile, shattered into 1,000 pieces. The shock of the truth brought with it a mixture of pain and clarity. I saw him sitting before me, trying to find justifications, but nothing was enough. There was no going back to the point where doubt still existed. The lie had been uprooted, and with it, the illusion that our marriage was unshakable. The fall from the pedestal was more profound because it didn't happen in front of a crowd, but in private. It was in the look he gave me that I sensed the weight of his fear, not only of losing his wife, but of losing the character he was playing in front of everyone. It was as if, in that moment, he had become small, human, flawed, incapable of sustaining his own performance. And curiously, I felt no pleasure in seeing him like that. What I felt was a strange mixture of grief and liberation. Grief for the life I believed I had. Liberation in no longer having to carry the lie. This revelation profoundly affected my mindset. I realized that for too long, I had placed my worth in the image we projected as a couple. I believed that being this man's wife also meant being validated by the community. When the mask fell, I understood that my identity could not be sustained by anyone other than myself and my faith. It was painful, but also transformative, because it showed me that sometimes the fall we fear most is precisely the push that makes us see life with new eyes. With every word he tried to say, I felt the distance between us widen. There was no longer any way to believe him. He spoke of regret, but his tone still carried more concern for his reputation than for the pain he had caused me. And this realization was like a second revelation. I understood that for him, the fall from the pedestal was not just about the betrayal itself, but about the impact that truth would have when it came to light. The fear of being exposed was greater than the regret for what he had done. That moment became a turning point in my journey. It was then that I realized I needed to break free from that invisible prison that held me hostage to what others would think. The man everyone admired no longer existed for me, and the truth that emerged freed me from continuing to live according to the image he maintained. It was time to make decisions based not on appearance, but on essence. And deep down, I realized that when a mask falls, it not only reveals the face of the one wearing it, but also lays bare how trapped we ourselves were in that theater. The silence of that night still echoes in my memory. There were no screams, no scandals. There was only the fall of an empire built on sand, and the certainty that from then on I would never be the same. It was in that moment that I understood, with absolute clarity, that the transformation I had so resisted had already begun. and that each step from then on would lead me down a path I had never imagined I would tread. I felt anger, pain, and even pity. It was as if all the emotions I'd bottled up for years exploded at once, a storm that respected neither order nor logic. The anger came like fire, burning every memory of trust, every sweet word that now felt like disguised poison. I remembered the times he'd preached about fidelity, about unconditional love, and I felt a deep revulsion. How could anyone have the courage to speak of something they'd never truly practiced? The pain, on the other hand, was quieter, like an open wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. It hurt to remember the time invested, the sleepless nights waiting for him, the prayers I'd said, believing our home was being protected. And pity arose when I saw that man, once admired by so many, reduced to his own fragility, unable to maintain the masks he'd created. But above all, amidst that emotional chaos, something unexpected emerged, a strange force, as if a new wind had begun to blow within me. It wasn't revenge, nor a desire to destroy his image in the eyes of others. It was something deeper, a revelation that I no longer needed to carry that weight alone. I realized that, as he fell from his pedestal, I was discovering a new mindset, a new way of looking at myself. For the first time in a long time, I felt that my life wasn't doomed to be defined by his choices. This storm of emotions showed me how much the journey of grief can also be a process of transformation. Because amidst tears and bitter memories, I began to understand that my identity no longer depended on the role of exemplary wife I'd been trying to uphold. I could be a woman of faith, I could be whole, I could be strong, even without being tied to him. And this revelation was like a key turning inside my heart, opening doors that previously seemed locked forever. Still, it wasn't easy to cope with the intensity of what I felt. There were days when anger overwhelmed me, and I wanted to shout to the world the hidden truth that so many needed to know. Other days, the pain was so profound that all I could do was cry silently, and there were moments of compassion when I wondered how someone, so invested in faith, could have lost their way. It was an emotional roller coaster, a constant impact that forced me to revisit memories and confront beliefs that had previously been untouchable. But amidst this confusion, that silent strength continued to grow. It was as if God was showing me that even in the chaos, he was still there, shaping me, leading me to a new chapter. The storm served not only to destroy what was around me, but also to reveal what remained firm within me. And it was in this scenario of intense emotions that I began to understand that pain could also be a portal, opening the way to decisions that would change the course of my life once and for all. When the truth came out, guess who was judged? Me, the woman who chose not to remain silent. It was as if I had suddenly become the villain of the story, the one who dared to break the silence, who had the courage to expose what many would prefer to keep hidden. The most painful part was not only dealing with his betrayal, but the way the community reacted. The people who embraced me on Sunday, who said they admired my faith and my stance, now looked at me with suspicion, as if I were responsible for the downfall of this man everyone held up as an example. It was a cruel reversal. He, the traitor, continued to be seen by many as a leader, a man in crisis who needed prayer and support. I, on the other hand, was treated as the bitter wife, the one who couldn't forgive, who let pride get the better of me. It was as if the pain I carried was an irrelevant detail compared to the need to keep his reputation intact. This hidden truth of the community's judgment was a harsh revelation because it showed how image often matters more than substance. I remember feeling the heavy gaze upon me, as if every step I took was being watched. There were whispers, advice disguised as criticism, and even prayers offered on my behalf that felt more like accusations. I was constantly reminded that God hates divorce. But almost no one talked about how much he also hates lies, infidelity, and injustice. This distorted mindset wounded me deeply because I realized that deep down, many were more concerned with preserving the institution's appearance than with seeing the real impact the situation had had on me. But at the same time, that judgment was what gave me even more clarity. I understood that I couldn't expect understanding from everyone, and that my journey would be lonely at times, the most painful. Revelation was realizing that the community that should be a place of healing often becomes a space of oppression for those who dare to speak their truth. And this realization led me to make a silent decision. I would not let the weight of others' gaze determine my life choices. It was at this point that my mindset began to shift irreversibly. I began to see that every criticism, every word of judgment was also an opportunity for transformation. Because, instead of silencing me, these reactions strengthened me. If before I still had doubts about taking a stand, now I was certain. My silence was no longer an option. And although the pain of being judged was immense, it also pushed me to a place of authenticity I had never experienced before. From that moment on, I understood that the real challenge wasn't just facing his betrayal, but also resisting the pressure of a system that preferred to see me submissive and silent. And it was in this clash with the community that I began to glimpse the possibility of writing my own story without needing to ask permission to be who I truly was. I wondered, am I the one at fault? Will God condemn me for exposing the lie? These questions haunted me like ghosts, day and night. And often I didn't know if the greater pain came from the betrayal or the blame they tried to place on me. It felt like carrying a cross that wasn't mine, as if I'd become responsible for the collapse of a marriage that was already fractured long before I decided to speak out. And the cruelest thing is that these doubts came not only from within, but also from external voices that insisted on reminding me that a woman of faith endures, that God restores homes, that forgiveness is greater than pain. As if I didn't know this, as if my faith were too small to understand that God's grace can restore. But no one seemed to care that I was also human, that my heart had limits, that trust, once broken, can't be rebuilt with just pretty speeches. The struggle against guilt became a battlefield within me. On one side, the need to preserve my dignity, my truth, to not allow lies to continue dictating the course of my life. On the other, the fear of failing God, of being judged not only by people, but by the Creator Himself. I knelt in prayer and asked, Lord, am I sinning by not accepting to live like this? Is it your will that I remain silent, even when the truth can no longer be hidden? The divine silence sometimes seemed to crush me, and yet there were moments when I felt an inexplicable peace, as if He were saying to me, Daughter, it was not you who destroyed this home. Do not carry the burden that is not yours. But the guilt is persistent. It returns disguised as memories, as demands, as the community's constant stares that seemed to judge me. I felt like I was at the center of an invisible tribunal, where every gesture was analyzed, every word weighed like a sentence. And in the midst of this judgment was my own inner voice, imbued with years of teachings that made me believe I should always be responsible for keeping everything together. The transformation in my mindset didn't happen overnight. It was a slow process, full of ups and downs, painful revelations, but also liberating discoveries. I began to realize that much of that guilt wasn't spiritual, but cultural. It was the weight of a tradition that had always placed on women the obligation to bear everything, even when they were being torn apart inside. It was a mentality that insisted that love endures all, but forgot that true love doesn't feed on lies. This revelation was like opening my eyes to a pattern that imprisoned me, and that imprisoned so many other women as well. I understood that bearing is not the same as self-denial, that forgiving doesn't mean accepting constant hurt, that remaining silent isn't synonymous with faith. The more I reflected, the more I understood that guilt was a prison built to keep me submissive. And deep down, I realized I had two choices before me. Either I continued living imprisoned, or I accepted the transformation that was happening within me, allowing this new mindset to guide me out of that cycle. That's when I began to see that true fidelity to God wasn't about protecting a facade, but about living in truth, even if it meant being judged by others. Still, I confess there were nights when the weight crushed me. I would lie in bed and hear the accusations echoing inside my mind. You destroyed your family. You weren't patient enough. You failed. But amidst this turmoil, there was also a flame that remained lit, reminding me that my journey didn't end there. I was just beginning to understand that the struggle with guilt wasn't just mine. It was the struggle of so many women who carry burdens they shouldn't have to carry. And this realization was what gave me the strength to keep going, because deep down, I knew there was still so much more to be revealed on this journey. I discovered that my faith was not in him, nor in the church, but in Christ, who never betrayed me. This revelation didn't come suddenly, like a light that suddenly turns on, but gradually emerged, like a dawn after a long, dark night. For a long time, I confused my devotion to God with the need to sustain a failing marriage or live up to community expectations. I believed that being faithful meant silently carrying a burden that wasn't mine, as if my obedience to God was directly linked to my submission to a man who didn't know how to honor the truth. But true faith showed me something else, that Christ never demands silence in the face of injustice, nor acceptance of a life built on lies. It was a profound process of transformation. I needed to dismantle every layer of belief that had been imposed on me over the years, until I reached the heart of what it truly means to believe. And along the way, I understood that the impact of true faith is not to keep us trapped in what destroys us, but to give us the courage to free ourselves. For the first time, I felt that my spirituality was not a prison, but a refuge. The Christ I sought at the church altar was with me behind the scenes of my pain, when I cried alone in my room, when I felt judged, when guilt tried to crush me. This new mindset freed me from an invisible prison. I realized that my faith didn't depend on my husband's behavior or the community's approval. It was mine, personal, built on intimacy with God. Christ didn't demand perfection from me, didn't condemn me for exposing the truth, didn't accuse me for seeking dignity. On the contrary, he reminded me that this was exactly why he came: to set the captives free, to heal broken hearts, to bring life where there was only emotional death. This revelation gave me the strength to start over from the inside out. I stopped looking at faith as a rigid manual and began to see it as a journey of love and truth. It was no longer about upholding an image, but about living according to the essence. I understood that true faith is not measured by the ability to endure the unbearable, but by the courage to walk in the light, even when darkness insists on surrounding us. And that changed everything: my way of thinking, my decisions, the way I looked to the future. Of course, it wasn't easy. There were days when the old mentality still tried to imprison me, whispering that I had no right to move forward, that my life was tainted. But in those moments, I remembered that the cross wasn't raised to maintain appearances, but to offer real redemption, the kind that reaches every part of our story, even the most painful. This encounter with genuine faith showed me that Christ never asked me to be silent, but called me to live in truth. And it was from this understanding that I began to envision a new journey, where my voice would have a place, where my story could finally be told without fear. I got divorced, cried for nights, but gradually I learned to breathe again. Signing that paper seemed so simple, just a few pens gliding over cold lines, but for me it was like closing an entire book of my life. I felt naked, groundless, aimless, as if I had lost not only a husband, but also a part of the identity that for years had been built around the we. There were days when I woke up and wondered who I was without him, without the title of wife, without that place that society and the church had given me. It was like crossing a desert, where each step was heavy and each night seemed endless. The new beginning was anything but romantic. It was painful, filled with memories that insisted on haunting me. I lay in the empty bed and felt the weight of silence, a void so deep it seemed to swallow me. She cried herself to sleep and often woke with her face still wet with tears. It was as if the grief of a dead marriage were a constant ghost, haunting every corner of my home and my heart. And yet, there was a spark within me that refused to be extinguished, a quiet, almost imperceptible force that pushed me forward even when I wanted to give up. I began to realize that pain didn't have to be my enemy. It could also be a portal of transformation. With each tear, I felt something inside me being cleansed, purified, prepared for something greater. Little by little, that feeling of failure was transformed into a learning experience. I understood that the end wasn't a sentence, but a new beginning. And even if I hadn't chosen this path, it was now part of my journey, and I needed to find in it the hidden meaning God wanted to reveal to me. Relearning to breathe was like going back to basics. I started taking care of myself, appreciating small gestures, like walking outdoors, reading a book slowly, sipping coffee in silence without the shadow of judgment. They were small steps, but each one had an immense impact, reminding me that I was still alive, that my story didn't end there. This new mindset showed me that starting over isn't a grand leap, but a succession of small movements that, together, lead us to a new life. Of course, there were days when everything seemed to recede, days when I felt too alone, too weak, too broken to carry on. But in those moments, I remembered that my faith was no longer in people, nor in institutions, but in the Christ who never betrayed me. This certainty helped me lift my head, even when my eyes were still red from crying. And it was in this mixture of pain and hope that I began to glimpse a new version of myself, someone who was emerging from the ashes of a destroyed life, but who now had the courage to write her own story. I understood that silencing pain only strengthens the aggressor. Speaking out is liberating. This awareness didn't emerge overnight, but it grew within me like a breath that grew stronger until it became a strong wind. For years, I carried a secret that crushed me, believing it was more holy to suffer in silence than to expose what was happening. I thought that keeping everything to myself was an act of obedience, when in reality, it was just a prison disguised as faith. Silence was convenient for him, for the community, and even for the family image so many admired. But for me, silence was corrosive, like a wound that never heals because there's no air to breathe. When I finally found the courage to voice my pain, something inside me changed forever. It wasn't easy. The first words came out shaky, as if I were betraying an invisible pact that bound me. But as I spoke, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in a long time. It was like opening a window in a dark room and letting the light in. I realized that speaking wasn't about destroying, but rebuilding. It wasn't about revenge. It was about liberation. I was freeing myself from the lie, from the weight of carrying alone a burden that should never have been mine. And the most surprising thing is that when I began sharing my truth, other women reached out, as if my voice were a password that also unlocked their silence. Hearing stories so similar to mine was painful, but also powerful. It was as if, together, we were tearing away a veil that had long covered the hidden truth of so many lives. This made me understand that my story wasn't just about betrayal, but about impact, about the transformation that happens when someone has the courage to say, "Enough, I will no longer be silent." Healing through truth isn't linear. At times, speaking out brought immediate relief. At others, it brought even more judgment and criticism. But even then, I knew I was on the right path because I was no longer trapped. The difference between silent pain and shared pain is that the latter opens space for hope. When the lie is exposed, it loses its power. When the wound is revealed, it begins to heal. Looking back today and realizing how I hid myself gives me clarity that silence was never spirituality. It was just fear. And fear cannot rule the life of someone who wants to be whole. Speaking out gave me back my identity, gave me the chance to reclaim my dignity, and more than that, to show other women that they are not alone. And it was in this process that I understood something even greater, something that would guide me to a new phase of my journey, in which pain would no longer be an end, but the starting point for something much deeper. I, Linda Marie Walker, 65, say from the heart, don't be afraid of the truth. It hurts, but it also liberates. I know because I've experienced firsthand every cut that lies have left, every scar that silence has deepened. I know the weight of carrying alone a story that seemed impossible to tell, of swallowing tears behind forced smiles, of dressing myself in strength when, in truth, I was in pieces. But I also know the power that exists when we decide to look reality in the eye, without more masks, without more excuses, without more justifications for what should never have been accepted. The truth has this impact. It breaks, but it also rebuilds. It frightens, but it also liberates. Today, looking back, I see that every decision I made led me to a transformation I never would have achieved had I remained silent. They were difficult, painful choices, fraught with judgment and loneliness, but also choices that restored my dignity, peace, and above all, the knowledge that my faith was not lost. On the contrary, it was refined in the fire of adversity. The hidden truth that once suffocated me became the revelation that made me see who I truly am. A whole woman, capable of pursuing her journey without relying on appearances or the approval of others. I understood that hope isn't born from a perfect life, but from the courage to start over after everything falls apart. I discovered that life can be rebuilt on new foundations, firmer, more authentic, and that every tear I shed watered the soil where freedom would flourish. Today I can say that I am not defined by what I lost, but by what I found. In the midst of pain, a new mindset, a new way of living, a deeper and truer faith. If there's one thing I want to leave you with, it's that you don't have to live imprisoned by lies, nor carry burdens that aren't yours. Silence may seem safe, but it's the truth that heals. My journey proves this. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary, because it led me here, to this moment where I can say with absolute certainty, there is life after pain, there is strength after a fall, and there is a future after loss. And it was at this point in the journey that something even stronger began to blossom within me, something that showed me that the story doesn't end with liberation alone, but continues with an even greater calling.